Well, I have with me today Glynn Harrison, who is Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Bristol. He was a practicing consultant psychiatrist, he was chair of the Department of Psychiatry, and he preaches locally and speaks very widely on a whole range of issues at the interface of faith, psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience, and he's particularly focused and interested on promoting men's ministries and the development of Christian leaders and pastors. But today we're wanting Glynn to focus on the subject of how the sexual revolution is changing us, changing our church, and changing our ministry. So Glynn, perhaps you could start by unpacking for us what the sexual revolution actually is.
Peter, thanks. Good to be here. The sexual revolution refers to the massive cultural and social changes that took place in the 60s and 70s in the wake of the radical new ideas that took root at that time in our culture. Ideas about how human beings flourish, ideas about how our sexual interests are to be ordered, family, marriage, that kind of thing. And the word revolution really, I think, accurately portrays the idea of upending. Things were overturned. And we're certainly in a very different place now, 50 years later, to where we were in the early 60s, late 50s.
Now, you often talk about the sexual revolution having a narrative and also having a moral vision as well, which is very different from that of Christianity. How would you describe that narrative and moral vision for us?
I mean, it is rooted in ideas, and maybe we'll come back to the ideas, but I think what a lot of Christians have missed, and this is important to understanding what I call the quiet revolution that's been taking place amongst Christians, evangelical Christians, the same thing happening, but at a less obvious level, the undermining of the traditional Christian ways of life. What we haven't realized is that the sexual revolution isn't just about promoting ideas, it's about the way those ideas are promoted. And it's about narrative, and it's about a new moral vision. If you take the idea of narrative, the philosopher Charles Taylor, he construes the modern secularism as being essentially a narrative. It's not just one set of ideas replacing another. It's held in the imagination as a story with heroes and villains. Heroes, Galileo, villains, the Catholic Church. And it's about progress. And similarly, the sexual revolution isn't just about a descent into moral anarchy. It's held in the popular imagination as a story, and it has its own heroes, people who stood against the tide of oppression and being beaten down by outdated Christian straitjacketing of our morals, people who had the courage to stand against the tide, be themselves.
So who are some of the heroes and who are the villains, if you like, of the sexual revolution? Could you give us some specific examples?
Yeah, well, the heroes would be, the guy who won the Eurovision Song Contest last year.
We're all heroes.
He's a guy, who's up there and he's very challenging because he comes with a beard in a dress, and he's saying, I have the courage to stand here and break out of those straitjackets of the past, and you can be yourself just like me. And it's telling that this year the person who won it similarly said we're all heroes no matter what we believe, how we live, who we are. And it's often the heroes have been presented in documentaries, drama, rom-coms, sitcoms, in all kinds of ways, but very attractive figures who have stood up and said, come on, let's be who we are, you can be like this. The villains aren't hard to spot. It's traditional Christians who...
So we're the villains?
Well, many Christians begin to feel that way because for the first time, Christians who hold to the traditional moral vision about the biblical moral vision about how people flourish are being made to feel an immoral minority. not just an intellectual minority, people who hold different set of ideas. We are an immoral minority, and that has powerful effects on us, on our emotions, on our sense of belonging relationally. We're not even beginning to get to grips with this. And so I think what I'm saying is we've been responding to a narrative with a strong emotional, moral vision, with often facts. And we need to stop trying to respond to a story with a list of facts. We need to tell a better story. That's the key, I think.
Can we get back to the roots of this? You talk about it beginning in the 60s and 70s, but were there key thinkers who were bringing in this ideology, and who were they?
I think that there was a fascinating convergence of ideas around the 60s. I think the cultural individualism gave the cultural headwind to these ideas. And of course, cultural individualism was on the back of the new prosperity of the 60s. Money was making its way into the pockets of young people, like me at the time, liberating us from many of those old social ties to family, community. We went off to university, pop music was in the ascendancy. So the cultural changes at that time facilitated the embedding of these new ideas. The new ideas, I think, are Tom Wright, the theologian, says that Gnosticism is a great controlling myth of our time. And ancient Gnosticism has bubbled away since Paul's time. He had to deal with it. But the idea that the outer world, even the outer world of our own bodies, is an impediment, is something that constricts and confines, is at the heart of Gnosticism. And to flourish, you need to discover the you that lies buried, dig it out, unearth it, and then be the you that you can be, choose to be, freed from these accretions of tradition, religion, this earthly reality, which is no reality at all. The reality is what you make it. Now that's Gnosticism, and Gnosticism paired with, well, I think what is a variant of Gnosticism, queer theory, which similarly says your body is just your felt experience, for example, of being gendered, male, female. It's a social construction. It's just an invention which has been foisted on you by our culture and the power elites that stand behind our culture,
yes,
to make you live in a certain way. Now you be free of that and break out of those categories.
So this is fascinating. The body is an impediment to the real you expressing yourself, and gender is a construction. And I've heard you talk about the social revolution reconstructing gender. Can you explain to us what you actually mean by that? How is gender being reconstructed by the sexual revolution?
Yeah, I think what I've really been keen to say is we need to discern that gender, I think the word I've used is deconstructing gender. It's about challenging that the notion that there is something basic to our felt reality. Our felt reality for most of us is we're male or female, that there's something basic and given about that. Now, queer theory, and it's rooted particularly in philosophers such as Michael Foucault, or modern theorists such as Judith Butler, they want to challenge that notion that there's anything basic that's given about our felt reality at all. These are socially constructed conventions that we're schooled into by our culture and the power elites behind them, you see. So it's about challenging those basic categories and saying, no, even as something as basic as male and female is simply a given. You don't have to be straitjacketed in those narratives. You can be you. If you want a beard in a dress, hey, these are stereotypes that we're being forced into. Be liberated, be yourself. And there's freedom there.
Now we're seeing all over the world at the moment the big push for the redefinition of marriage and the legalization of same-sex marriage. Is that whole phenomenon part of the sexual revolution? Is it another kind of deconstruction that we're witnessing?
It's interesting. And I think we need to discern that many people who are pro redefining marriage to make it more inclusive, that's what so-called gay marriage or equal marriage is about. It's about making it more inclusive. Many of those folk are motivated by a genuine desire and compassion to see people helped flourish. And so there's a very plausible narrative in there which says, look, you're saying that marriage is something that brings flourishing, that it's good for human relationships, stability, faithfulness, for society more generally. Let's make those goods of marriage available to more people. Now, we've got to understand that there's real compassion and there's real concern for fairness and equality there, and recognize that in those making that argument. And I really respect that. I think, though, that we then need to make the counter-argument to point out that, yes, if you include in a thing, include more people into something, that can be a good thing, provided you don't change the thing itself. If you change the nature of the thing itself by including them, you're not including them in anything, because you're deconstructing, changing the very nature. And what I think we need to argue is, it's no use looking out for the needs or resolving the needs of a subset of the bees in a hive, if in doing so, in serving the needs of a subset, you destroy the whole hive. There are some sacred community values that serve all of us in the long run. And as much as our heart goes out to some who seem to be excluded by that or feel on the outside of that, it's as much, we've got to find ways of helping, but it's no use finding a way of helping that includes some and then destroys the whole. And the problem with equal marriage is that it redefines marriage in a quite fundamental way. And there is no doubt that you have then, in the wake of that, to redefine what a parent is, what a family is, and the whole concept of marriage and family begins to unravel.
How do the roles of men and women play into this? You've talked about, along with queer theory and Gnosticism being drivers of this new ideology, you've talked about radical feminism and its role there as well. Do you want to talk us through that and how that's impacting on men's and women's roles?
Well, again, we need to recognize the virtues in some of the arguments that are being made. We have, in the church, often been perceived as buying into sex role stereotypes, which have diminished women, and we have. And it's there in our hearts. Misogyny bubbles away in the human heart. And we need to recognize that some of those stereotypes have diminished women, and they, quite rightly, people outside have lost trust in us. And yet, I think we have to, whilst conceding some of that, make the case, once again, it's no use throwing out the baby with the bathwater, in that we may have got wrong how difference is to be worked out. Let's not lose the notion of difference. Yes. Because complementarity between the sexes, the dance between male and female, the coming together of male and female in a way, in a union that's intrinsically open to children, we as Christians believe is quite a sacred, given thing, a way in which we're called to walk. And we deconstruct that, we mess with that at our cost, not simply the cost to we Christians for whom this is a strong value, but for all of us in the long run.
Now, getting practical with this, because people watching this interview will be saying, well, the sexual revolution, I'm starting to understand what it is, but what particular pressures is it creating specifically for Christian parents who are trying to bring up children in the faith against this kind of background that their children are being exposed to?
Well, yes, I think many of our kids, as they're exposed to these new ideas and these new narratives, they see some of the goods of those arguments, and they come home and they're beginning to challenge some of the more traditional Christian ideals and standards, and I think a good that's coming out of this is Christian parents have got to engage with schooling our children in what we feel to be a good way of life, and that means. I was at a conference recently, and there was a stall there. Somebody, and the stall was promoting marriage, and it had various tools and resources for youth groups and so on. And this person, he was a doctor, and he said, "Why would we want to tell teenagers about marriage? I mean, 14-year-olds. Why are you bothered telling them about marriage? They're nowhere near getting married." I mean, this is an extraordinary observation, because we need to be teaching our children about the goods of the Christian moral vision, probably at age 5 or 6. We can't avoid talking to our kids about sex and marriage. So I think that's going to be a good thing that comes out of this. But clearly it does create some tensions, because there is a narrative out there in the world, in secular culture, which says you've got to be whatever you feel yourself to be. The notion that there's a way in which to walk is increasingly alien, and we've got to make clear in our culture as Christians that we understand that this is about the best for a kid. We want to bring out the best in them. No, we don't want to beat anybody down. We want to understand what's on their hearts, but neither do we want to surrender that there are good ways of living, and that there are good ways of nurturing our interests, our sexual desires. There are ways which we can school and nurture them that produce flourishing, and there are ways that produce harm. So those are some of the tensions. I don't have easy answers, but I certainly think this is an area that we need to engage with as parents.
So promoting the biblical idea of gender, of marriage, helping them to see marriage and God's model as very positive.
Yeah.
But on more on the negative side, if you like, how can we as Christian parents protect our children from being seduced by this whole new ideology and new moral vision? Because it is very seductive.
Yeah. Well, it begins by showing before telling. It's the schooling of our kids begins in the way we live. And one of the tragedies of much Christian culture, evangelical culture, is that we began buying into the sexual revolution decades ago in sex before marriage and in our divorce rate, yes, which is seriously worrying.
Yes.
And we need to show, and so in the first instance, it's about recovering faith and trust, even excitement in this Christian moral vision in our own hearts, and modeling that in our lives. I'm always saying to Christian men, husbands, you need to pay attention. We need to be paying attention to our responsibilities under God for flourishing marriages, flourishing homes. This is something that's men's business, and the care and nurture of children too. I think, though, after showing it, in terms of sharing with our kids, as I said earlier, we've got to recognize the goods in the arguments that they're hearing, and then offer a better alternative vision, one that's plausible, that's rooted in our belief that the Christian way of life, in the end, is good. It's good for us because God's good and the gospel's good.
Looking more widely in the Christian community, what particular pressures is the sexual revolution placing on Christian churches, and how can pastors and church communities help to engage with this and prevent an erosion of Christian beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really concerned that we are losing the argument, not in wider culture. I think almost in wider culture it's lost at the moment. We're losing the argument amongst our own people, amongst our own young people. And whilst we must never abandon the public square, I think the genius of Martin Luther King was that he always insisted that equality, black-white equality, isn't just good for blacks, as he put it. It's not just good for the black community. He said, this is good for everybody. This is good for you. That was what drove him. And so he didn't abandon the public square, and neither must we. We must insist that the values that we hold, the ideals that we believe God's given us about how we should live, isn't just good for us, good for everybody. But at the moment, we have to revitalize these ways of thinking and life in our own hearts, in our own communities. And I think this is a big agenda for pastors and teachers right now.
So it's both about teaching and discipling in the context of the local church and community, but also about being a voice for this values and this Christian vision in the public square and more widely as well.
I think we've got to give the voice. There's a lot we need to attend to there in terms of tone and approach. I'm not sure there are good ways of doing this, there are bad ways of doing it. I'm not sure we've always got the tone right. But I guess really I'm saying that the first priority now is to revitalize this vision in our own hearts, in our own communities, because you can't just tell this, you've got to live it out and model it. And I think that's our first priority right now.
Do you see that the sexual revolution provides an opportunity for the gospel, but behind the threat that perhaps many of us feel, is there also an opportunity for us in preaching Christ?
Do you know, I think we've got to recover the great gospel truth that in Christian marriage, God has etched into the structure of Christian marriage, into male, female coming together in sexual intimacy to produce children, that's open to children. He has etched into the very structure of that the gospel story. Paul says it's about Christ and the church. It's about the kind of lover that God is. He's not a here today, gone tomorrow, one night stand lover. He is a faithful lover. And when a man and a woman come together and they commit to that faithfulness, they're saying he's that kind of a God. He's a faithful, covenantal God. And we not only tell it, but in our very relationships, we show it. Actually, a single person, they point to this truth too, because when they say, I'm not going to have sex outside of marriage, they're also saying, because God's not that kind of God. He's always faithful in his intimate love for us. So both, we're all in a way pointing to big truths, and this is about living out the gospel as well as preaching it. And I think the sociologist Rodney Stark, very interesting book, The Rise of Christianity. He asks, as a sociologist, what was it about Christianity that led this little group of people who were so fired by the resurrection of Christ that by the 4th century AD, an entire empire was on the edge of faith. He said one of the big factors in that was their ways of life, the way they treated children, the way they treated women, the way they treated slaves, all of those things. The pagans looked at these ways of life and they said, we want that. And I think there's an opportunity in the sexual revolution for us to retell the gospel story in our lives, in our words, all over again, by living lives that honor God's ways and prove to the world, show to the world that these are good ways, because God is good and the gospel's good.
So it's both about living in an authentic Christian way that demonstrates the goodness of God through the quality of our relationships, but also being able to tell the Christian story in a way that engages with the sexual revolution. Now, I was interested to hear you alluding to that beautiful allegory that the Bible gives us of man and woman coming together in marriage being, if you like, a kind of metaphor of the marriage of Christ as he comes to gather his bride, the church. And do you think there's a way in which we can use or revive that metaphor in being able to communicate the gospel to a generation which is, if you like, seduced by the sexual revolution? Is there a place, a gospel opportunity in presenting that relationship?
Yeah, I think there's a place for it. I'm not sure we'd necessarily want to front end our apologetics with it, but it needs to be a part of what I'd see as a new kind of apologetics. I'm always saying this. If when Christians go out to a dinner party, people don't always ask. The first question today isn't fine-tuning arguments or cosmological. What do you think about gay marriage? So we need to have ways of engaging which are winsome and compelling. And so I do think this needs to be an important part of how we preach the gospel and show the gospel. I think it is a tragedy that many Christian weddings, the wedding is almost ceremony itself. The meaning of marriage is barely explained. And we use our weddings as a sort of a gospel opportunity to preach the gospel in a way that's quite detached from what's going on here. And we need to if I might use the word, remarry the truth of the gospel with Christian marriage to show how this shows what is happening to this couple here, and what they're undertaking is telling us and showing us some big truths about God himself.
Because there's a sense in which that marriage demonstrates what's happening in the gospel. So why bring the two
It puts
apart?
It on display.
Yes.
In fact,
so perhaps
story.
that brings us on to our final question. How can churches better model the biblical vision for human sexuality?
Well, we mustn't make marriage itself an idol. The marriage is one of the ways in which we show the gospel. Of course, churches need to be a community in which there are healthy, flourishing marriages. There's no doubt that families are a key component of church life. But we need to get away from the secular idea of nuclear family that looks after us, to the notion of families with much looser, truly inclusive families, which include all kinds of folk into something of their life. I know a single pastor who, every week has breakfast with a family, and he goes in and he feels part of that family for that time. And there are all kinds of ways in which we can ensure that our families are inclusive and extending in our church communities. But equally, we need to find language and ways of honoring those who are not married, and particularly, honoring those who choose chastity while they're not married, because they're telling, as I said earlier, they're telling the story of the gospel as well. They're talking of God's faithfulness. We need to massively honor that by talking about it, and by honoring those people, different, those who are single, those who are married, ensuring that we're building a community which is truly loving and truly inclusive. I think within those communities too, we're going to have to get used to what I call dissonances. What I mean by that is we need to pray for all kinds of people to be coming into our churches. It's going to be there are going to be people in same-sex relationships. There are going to be people in threesomes. This isn't far away, this notion of blended families maybe living together in a threesome. There are going to be people with various gender dissonances, all kinds of issues. And of course the most common one is just cohabiting couples. People whose lives, just like all our lives, don't meet up to the ideal that God sets before us. we need our communities to be places of welcome for them, real welcome, real inclusion, but in a way which we can still hold to what we believe to be true. So it's something about our communities being grace-filled places where people feel they're welcomed and loved, but we don't give up what we believe to be true. So we'd love you to be part of our fellowship, to join in we'd love to serve you in any way we can. But these are our ideals. This is what we believe, and this is the way of discipleship that this community is always steering all of us to, not just people with sexual struggles, people who are greedy, materialistic. We're all being schooled in the way of God and in discipleship. And I think we need to get better at handling that sense of dissonance, that sometimes people live lives very different from what we believe. How do we hold on to what we believe but love them just the same? That's something we need to think about.
Yes, and I guess we see in Jesus himself the perfect demonstration of that, in that people found him attractive, they found him welcoming,
Yeah.
and yet in meeting him they were challenged to turn and live a completely different moral vision. So it was transforming for them, and yet they came to him and welcomed that transformation. Glynn, thank you so much for your time today and helping us to understand this key issue that we all need to grapple with.